The letter sits on Dwight Eisenhower's desk, marked secret and confidential. It has remained untouched for nearly an hour. Outside his headquarters in North Africa, the Mediterranean heat bears down, but inside this room, the air feels cold. He has drafted versions of this letter 3 times now. Each iteration says the same thing in different words. General George S. Patton is to be relieved of command and sent home. Each time, his pen has stopped before signing. This is not anger. Eisenhower has moved past anger. This is calculation. This is the arithmetic of war, where one man's brilliance must be weighed against the damage he causes. And George Patton, for all his genius on the battlefield, has finally pushed the Allied command structure to its breaking point. The reports are stacked in front of him. Eyewitness accounts, official complaints, photographs. The evidence is overwhelming, and it keeps growing. Eisenhower knows that if he does nothing, he will lose the confidence of his superiors, his allies, and perhaps the moral authority to lead this coalition at all. But if he removes Patton, he may lose Sicily and possibly the war in Europe. There are moments in command when all choices feel wrong. This is one of them. And in this room, in this hour, Dwight Eisenhower is deciding whether to destroy the career of the most effective battlefield commander the American Army has produced in a generation. The clock on the wall ticks. The letter waits. And George Patton, hundreds of miles away, has no idea how close he is to losing everything. Before we go further, if you appreciate this kind of deep historical storytelling, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. And I'm curious, what would you have done in Eisenhower's position? Drop a comment below. This is not a story about a single mistake. It's the story of a crisis that had been building for months, a breaking point that forced the Supreme Allied Commander to confront an impossible question. How much can you tolerate from a man you cannot afford to lose? What happened between Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton in the summer and fall of 1943 was not just a command dispute. It was a collision between 2 fundamentally different understandings of what leadership meant in wartime. And it very nearly ended with Patton being sent home in disgrace, his career finished, his name stripped from the operational plans that would shape the invasion of Europe. This is the story of how close that came to happening, and why, in the end, it didn't. George S. Patton Jr. was not a man built for peacetime. Born into military aristocracy, raised on stories of cavalry charges and Napoleonic glory, he had spent his entire life preparing for war with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His childhood had been filled with tales of Confederate ancestors, of cavalry raids and desperate charges, and he had absorbed these stories until they became the foundation of his identity. He read military history obsessively, studied the campaigns of Alexander and Caesar and Napoleon, and convinced himself that he was destined for the same kind of martial immortality. By 1943, at 57 years old, he had finally found his purpose. North Africa and Sicily had proven what he had always believed, that he was born to command armies in combat, that his instincts for maneuver and aggression were unmatched, and that history would remember him as one of the great captains of his age. The interwar years, when promotion was glacially slow and most officers stagnated in garrison duty, had been torture for Patton. He had watched younger men take safe careers in civilian life, while he remained committed to an army that seemed to have no future. But he had waited, and now his patience was being rewarded. He was not entirely wrong about his abilities. Patton's capacity to drive an army forward, to maintain offensive momentum when others would consolidate and rest, was genuinely extraordinary. His understanding of terrain, of logistics, of the psychological factors that determined whether an attack succeeded or stalled, was sophisticated in ways that many of his peers could not match. He had an instinct for identifying the weak points in enemy defenses and exploiting them before the enemy could react. His Third Army would later sweep across France with a speed that stunned both allies and enemies, covering distances in days that conventional military wisdom said should take weeks. He understood armored warfare at a level few American officers could match. While many senior commanders still thought in terms of infantry advances supported by tanks, Patton grasped that armor could be the spearhead, that properly employed tank divisions could penetrate deep into enemy territory and create chaos that would collapse entire defensive systems. He was fearless, often recklessly so, and his men knew it. He would appear at the front lines during attacks, making himself visible under fire, demonstrating the kind of physical courage that inspired soldiers even when they hated him personally. There was a genuine magnetism to Patton, a force of personality that could turn a demoralized unit into an attacking spearhead through sheer willpower. He could walk into a command post where officers were ready to report that further advance was impossible, and through force of personality and tactical insight, convince them that not only was advance possible, but that it was the only acceptable option. He radiated certainty, and in the confusion and terror of combat, certainty was a weapon as valuable as artillery. But Patton was also a catastrophe waiting to happen. His temperament was volcanic. His judgment outside of tactical matters was frequently terrible. He alienated subordinates, infuriated superiors, and seemed psychologically incapable of restraint. He believed that discipline meant brutality, that compassion was weakness, and that his own genius exempted him from the normal standards of military conduct. Eisenhower had known this for years. They had been friends once in the long, slow peacetime army where ambitious officers watched their careers stagnate and dreamed of the war that would prove their worth. Eisenhower understood what Patton was. He had watched him grandstand, provoke, and offend throughout the North African campaign. But he had also watched Patton win. That was the essential problem. Patton was indispensable and intolerable in equal measure. And by the summer of 1943, as Allied forces secured Sicily and began planning for the invasion of Italy and eventually France, the balance was shifting. The political cost of keeping Patton was rising, and Eisenhower was the one who had to pay it. The warning signs had been accumulating for months. In North Africa, Patton had delivered inflammatory speeches to his troops that verged on the bloodthirsty, talking about killing the enemy with a relish that made staff officers uncomfortable. He had publicly feuded with British commanders, treating coalition warfare as a competition rather than a collaboration. His ego required constant management, and Eisenhower found himself spending valuable time soothing Patton's wounded pride instead of focusing on operations. But these were irritations, not crises. Eisenhower could manage them. What he could not manage, what no one could have predicted, was what Patton would do when confronted with something he could not understand. Human frailty under the stress of combat. The problem began, as so many problems do, with a failure of empathy. Patton did not believe in combat fatigue. He did not believe that men could break under the psychological strain of sustained warfare. In his worldview, shaped by a lifetime of romanticizing violence, there were brave men and cowards, and nothing in between. He had no framework for understanding that courage was not infinite, that even the strongest soldiers could reach a point where their minds simply shut down under the accumulated horror of modern combat. This blindness would cost him everything, and it began in a hospital tent in Sicily on a sweltering August afternoon. The first incident occurred on August 3, 1943, at the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia, Sicily. Patton, visiting wounded men as commanders often did, encountered a young private named Charles H. Cool. The soldier was sitting on a cot, visibly shaking, with no apparent physical injuries. When Patton asked what was wrong, Cool replied that he couldn't take it anymore, that his nerves were shot. What happened next would be recounted in sworn statements, investigated by medical personnel, and eventually reported all the way to Washington. Patton exploded. He began shouting at the young soldier, calling him a coward, accusing him of malingering. And then, in front of wounded men and medical staff, he slapped Cool across the face with his glove, and as the soldier staggered away, Patton kicked him in the rear, physically driving him from the tent. He then threatened to have him shot. The medical personnel were horrified. Cool was not malingering. He was suffering from what we would now recognize as severe combat stress reaction, possibly compounded by malaria and dysentery. He had been in continuous combat for weeks. His unit had taken heavy casualties. He had reached the end of his psychological endurance, and his body was shutting down in response to trauma it could no longer process. But to Patton, this was weakness. This was a man failing in his duty. And in Patton's mind, the appropriate response was public humiliation and the threat of execution. The incident was reported up the chain of command, but slowly. Medical officers were reluctant to create a formal complaint against a three-star general. General Omar Bradley, Patton's nominal subordinate commanding the Second Corps, received an early report and chose to lock it in his personal safe rather than forward it immediately. Bradley understood what this could mean for Patton's career, and the old bonds of the officer corps made him hesitate. Some hoped it was an aberration, a momentary loss of control that would not be repeated. That hope died 1 week later. On August 10th, Patton visited the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. There he encountered another soldier, Private Paul G. Bennett, who was also hospitalized for combat exhaustion. Bennett had been in combat for 4 years, having enlisted before the war. He had fought in North Africa and through the Sicily campaign. He was, by any reasonable standard, a combat veteran who had given everything he had to give. Patton saw a coward. Once again he began shouting. Once again he accused the soldier of malingering. And once again he struck him, this time multiple times, and drew his pistol, threatening to shoot Bennett on the spot. Medical staff had to intervene to prevent further violence. Patton then ordered that Bennett be sent back to the front immediately, without treatment. This time, the medical officers did not wait. Reports were filed. Eyewitness accounts were recorded. The incident was too public, too violent, and too clearly a violation of basic standards of conduct to be ignored. Within days, word had reached Eisenhower's headquarters, and that was when the crisis truly began, because Eisenhower now faced a decision that would define his command and possibly the outcome of the war. The reports landed on Eisenhower's desk like grenades. His first reaction was disbelief, then anger, then a sinking realization of how catastrophic this could become. Patton had not just lost his temper. He had physically assaulted enlisted men who were under medical care. He had done it in front of witnesses. And he had done it twice, which meant it was not a momentary lapse but a pattern of behavior that revealed something deeply wrong in his character. Eisenhower understood immediately that this could not be handled quietly. Too many people knew. The medical staff knew. The wounded soldiers knew. Word was spreading through the 7th Army, and if it reached the press, if it reached Congress, if it reached the American public, the political consequences would be catastrophic. But firing Patton posed its own catastrophic risks. The Sicily campaign was still underway, and Patton's 7th Army had performed brilliantly. More importantly, the planning for the invasion of France was accelerating, and Eisenhower genuinely believed that Patton was the best field commander available for the kind of deep, rapid armored offensives that would be required. Removing him now could weaken the entire Allied effort at a critical moment. The pressure began building from every direction, and it was relentless. Medical officers wanted Patton court-martialed. They saw him as a threat to the well-being of soldiers and to the credibility of combat psychiatry, which was only beginning to be taken seriously as a medical field. His actions had humiliated men who had fought honorably and suffered deeply. Justice demanded consequences. These were not minor figures making noise. These were experienced medical personnel who had spent months treating the psychological casualties of modern warfare, who had seen strong men broken by sustained combat, and who understood that Patton's actions were not just cruel but medically ignorant. From London, British command was watching carefully, and their judgment was harsh. They had always been skeptical of Patton, seeing him as a dangerous glory seeker who treated coalition operations as personal competitions. Montgomery in particular had clashed with Patton repeatedly, and the British High Command was already weary of managing Patton's ego alongside actual military operations. This incident confirmed their worst fears and gave them ammunition to argue that American command culture was fundamentally flawed. Some began quietly suggesting that Patton was more trouble than he was worth, that his tactical brilliance did not justify the chaos he created. The political dimension of coalition warfare meant that Eisenhower could not simply dismiss these concerns as British prejudice. The alliance was fragile enough without giving Britain's leadership reasons to question American judgment. From Washington, the reaction was more complicated and perhaps more dangerous. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff and Eisenhower's ultimate superior, understood Patton's value as a commander. Marshall was one of the few men in the American military establishment who truly grasped the scope of what the war would require, and he knew that commanders with Patton's specific skills were extraordinarily rare. But Marshall also understood politics better than almost anyone in uniform. He knew Congress, knew the press, knew the American public, and he could see exactly how this would play if it became public knowledge. If this became public, Congress would demand answers. The military affairs committees would hold hearings. Senators would make speeches about the sacred duty to protect American soldiers from abuse, and those speeches would be politically popular because they would be morally correct. The American people who were sending their sons to fight and die in this war would be outraged to learn that a general was beating soldiers for suffering psychological wounds. Marshall could not protect Patton from that kind of firestorm. No one could. And underlying all of this was a deeper problem that Marshall and Eisenhower both understood. The slapping incidents raised questions about the culture of American military leadership. If a three-star general believed it was acceptable to physically assault enlisted men under his command, what did that say about how the Army functioned? What did it say about accountability, about the protection soldiers could expect from the military justice system, about whether rank truly did bring immunity from consequences? These were not abstract questions. They went to the heart of whether the American public would continue to trust military leadership with the lives of their children, and that trust was essential to maintaining support for the war effort. If it eroded, if families began to fear that their sons were being abused by their own commanders as much as they feared enemy action, the political foundation of the war effort would crack. And in the middle of all this pressure, all these competing demands and loyalties and calculations, sat Dwight Eisenhower, trying to find a path that served the mission without destroying what remained of his own moral authority. He was not a particularly dramatic man. He did not have Patton's flair for the theatrical or his hunger for personal glory. Eisenhower's strength was in managing complexity, in finding ways to balance competing interests and keep coalition forces working together toward common goals. But this situation was testing those abilities to their limit. Eisenhower ordered an investigation. He wanted every detail, every witness account, every piece of evidence. And as the reports came in, they were worse than he had feared. Patton had not shown remorse. He had defended his actions, insisting that he was instilling discipline and weeding out cowards. He genuinely believed he had done the right thing. In his mind, he had been protecting the morale of his army by publicly demonstrating that weakness would not be tolerated. He could not see that he had instead demonstrated that psychological suffering would be met with violence, that soldiers in crisis would be abandoned rather than helped. This was the detail that may have troubled Eisenhower most. A mistake, a loss of temper, could be forgiven. Eisenhower himself had lost his temper on occasion. Command in war brought stresses that could break through any man's self-control. But Patton's complete lack of understanding about what he had done wrong suggested a fundamental flaw in his judgment that went beyond a momentary lapse. It suggested that this would happen again, that Patton was incapable of learning from this incident because he did not believe there was anything to learn. And that made him not just a problem, but a potentially catastrophic liability. Eisenhower began drafting options, working late into the night in his headquarters, trying to map out every possible course of action and its consequences. The most extreme option was immediate relief from command and return to the United States, effectively ending Patton's military career. This would satisfy the demands for justice and remove a source of ongoing problems. The medical personnel would be vindicated. The British would be satisfied. Congress, if they learned of the incident, would see that justice had been served, but it would also deprive the Allied forces of a commander who had proven irreplaceable in certain types of operations, and it would send a message to other commanders that one mistake, however serious, could end a career regardless of past performance or future potential. The middle option was to relieve Patton from command of the 7th Army, but keep him in theater in a reduced role, perhaps commanding a corps or working in planning. This would be a severe punishment, a public humiliation that might satisfy critics while preserving Patton's tactical expertise for future use. It would demonstrate that accountability existed even for successful generals, while still acknowledging that Patton had value that should not be entirely discarded. But it would also create command problems, as Patton would be serving under officers who had previously been his peers or subordinates, and his ego might make that situation unmanageable. The minimal option was a severe reprimand and mandatory apology, combined with keeping the incident as quiet as possible to avoid public scandal. This would preserve Patton's command and avoid disruption to ongoing operations, but it would also look like Eisenhower was protecting a general who had assaulted enlisted men, which could destroy his own credibility as a leader. If word got out that this had happened and Patton had kept his command with only a slap on the wrist, the political consequences would be devastating. Eisenhower would be seen as putting military effectiveness ahead of justice, as protecting his friends at the expense of the men they commanded. For weeks, Eisenhower wrestled with the decision. Sleep became difficult. He would lie awake running through scenarios, trying to find some option he had missed, some way to thread the needle that would satisfy justice without crippling the war effort. He wrote letters to Patton that were never sent, drafting and redrafting the language, trying to find words that could make Patton understand the magnitude of what he had done. Some of these drafts were angry, others disappointed, others coldly professional. None of them seemed adequate to the situation. He consulted with his staff, with Marshall, with trusted advisors, trying to find consensus where none existed. Everyone had an opinion, and every opinion was passionate and contradictory. Some argued that Patton was too valuable to lose. Others argued that principles mattered more than tactical effectiveness. Still others tried to find middle positions that satisfied no one. The debate became circular, exhausting, and ultimately unhelpful. Eisenhower realized that this was a decision he would have to make alone, that no amount of consultation would give him certainty about the right choice. And all the while, the clock was ticking, because the longer this remained unresolved, the more likely it was to leak. And if the press got hold of this story before Eisenhower had made a decision, the decision would be made for him. Public outrage would force Patton's removal, and Eisenhower's own judgment would be compromised by his failure to act decisively. The worst outcome would be to lose Patton anyway, but also lose credibility for having delayed and appeared indecisive. Late in August 1943, Eisenhower made his choice. Or rather, he made a series of choices, each one designed to balance the competing pressures that threatened to tear apart the command structure he had spent years building. He drafted a letter secret and confidential that would serve as both reprimand and ultimatum. He sent it to Patton not through normal channels, but via Major General John P. Lucas, a trusted intermediary who could ensure the message was delivered privately and with the full weight of Eisenhower's authority behind it. The letter made clear that Patton's conduct had been inexcusable, that it had damaged the Allied cause, and that only Patton's value as a battlefield commander had prevented his immediate relief. But Eisenhower would not fire Patton. Not yet. He would come as close as possible without actually pulling the trigger. And he would make Patton understand, in terms that could not be misunderstood, that he was on the thinnest possible ice, that one more incident would end his career permanently. Eisenhower summoned Patton to his headquarters. The meeting was private, but those who saw Patton enter and leave reported that he looked shaken in a way few had ever seen. Eisenhower did not shout. He did not need to. He simply laid out the facts, the eyewitness accounts, the medical reports, the political consequences that were already beginning to ripple outward from Sicily. And then he gave Patton his options. He could apologize, publicly and sincerely, to the soldiers he had struck, to the medical personnel who had witnessed it, and to every division in the 7th Army. He could submit to this humiliation, this public acknowledgement that he had failed as a leader, and in exchange, he would keep his command for Mao. Or he could refuse, and Eisenhower would relieve him immediately and send him home in disgrace. It was a masterpiece of command psychology. Eisenhower was forcing Patton to choose his own punishment, to participate in his own humiliation, which made it both more effective and more likely to actually change his behavior. And by making the apology public and specific, Eisenhower was ensuring that Patton could never claim this had been handled quietly or that he had been let off easy. Patton, to his credit or perhaps simply out of survival instinct, accepted. He began a tour of every division under his command, standing in front of assembled troops and apologizing for his conduct. The apologies were awkward, stilted, and clearly painful for a man of Patton's pride. But he did it. He faced thousands of soldiers and admitted that he had been wrong, that he had failed to understand the nature of combat stress, that he had dishonored men who deserved better. The reception was mixed and often cold. Many soldiers watched in silence, offering no acknowledgement. Others were openly skeptical, muttering among themselves that Patton wasn't really sorry, that this was just a performance forced on him by higher command. Some officers reported hearing men say, "He doesn't mean it," or "he's just covering his ass," as Patton left their formations. The apology tour was devastating to Patton's ego, but it may have done little to repair the actual damage to morale and trust. For a man who had built his entire identity around projecting strength and certainty, this public vulnerability was perhaps the worst punishment Eisenhower could have devised. But whether it actually changed anything in the hearts of the men who heard it remained an open question. But it was not enough to contain the crisis, because in early November, despite Eisenhower's best efforts to keep the incidents quiet, the story broke in the American press. The journalist Drew Pearson, known for his investigative reporting and willingness to challenge military authority, broadcast the details of the slapping incidents on his national radio program. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Newspapers across America ran front-page stories. Congress demanded investigations. The public reaction was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Patton became a national scandal. Editorial writers called for his court-martial. Veterans organizations demanded his removal. Parents of servicemen wrote letters asking how their sons could be expected to serve under a general who beat soldiers for suffering psychological wounds. The political pressure that Eisenhower had been trying to avoid came crashing down with full force. And once again, Eisenhower faced the same impossible choice, but now with the entire nation watching. The pressure to fire Patton was now almost overwhelming. Secretary of War Henry Stimson was receiving hundreds of letters demanding action. Congressional leaders were publicly questioning whether the Army had any standards of conduct at all. The scandal was threatening to undermine public confidence in military leadership at a critical moment in the war. But Eisenhower held firm. He released a statement explaining that Patton had been disciplined, that he had apologized, and that the matter had been handled according to military regulations. He defended the decision to keep Patton in command by pointing to his battlefield record and the military necessity of retaining effective commanders. He took the political heat himself, absorbing the criticism and anger that might otherwise have forced a different decision. It was a calculated risk of enormous proportions. Eisenhower was betting his own reputation and credibility on the belief that Patton's value as a battlefield commander outweighed the political cost of keeping him. He was betting that the American public would eventually accept this judgment, or at least that the military necessity would be clear in retrospect. And he was betting that Patton would learn from this experience and never put him in this position again. That last bet was the most dangerous one, because Patton had a remarkable ability to learn exactly the wrong lessons from his mistakes. In the immediate aftermath of the scandal, Patton was sidelined. He was not given a command in the invasion of Italy. He was not included in the early planning for the cross-channel invasion of France. For months, he existed in a professional limbo, waiting to see if his career was truly over, or if Eisenhower would give him another chance. This period may have been the most important in Patton's life. He was forced to confront the consequences of his actions in a way he had never done before. His name, which he cared about above almost everything, had been dragged through the mud. His reputation was tarnished, possibly permanently, and the war that he had spent his entire life preparing for was moving forward without him. Some officers who knew Patton during this period reported that he was genuinely shaken, that for the first time in his life he understood that his behavior had real consequences beyond his own ego. Others believed he was simply calculating his next move, waiting for the scandal to fade so he could resume his march toward glory. Eisenhower watched and waited. He received regular reports on Patton's conduct, his statements, his interactions with other officers. He was looking for some sign that Patton had actually changed, that the humiliation had taught him something beyond the tactical lesson of being more careful about witnesses. And slowly, as the invasion of France drew closer, Eisenhower began to believe that he could use Patton again. Not because Patton had reformed or because the scandal had been forgiven, but because the tactical situation demanded it. The kind of deep armored offensive that Eisenhower envisioned for the breakout from Normandy required a commander with Patton's specific skills. And despite everything, despite the slapping incidents and the scandal and the political nightmare, Patton was still the best option available. So Eisenhower made another choice. He would give Patton command of the Third Army, one of the main attacking forces in the invasion of France. But he would do it quietly, and he would make absolutely certain that Patton understood this was his last chance. One more incident, one more scandal, one more moment of uncontrolled ego, and the career would be over. In January 1944, Patton received the news he would command the Third Army in the invasion of Europe. For Patton, it was resurrection. For Eisenhower, it was a calculated gamble that the war's outcome might depend on. The decision was not universally popular. Many officers believed Patton had gotten away with assault and should have been court-martialed regardless of his tactical abilities. Medical personnel were particularly bitter, seeing the decision as a betrayal of the soldiers who had been struck and a message that generals were above accountability. Some members of Congress continued to call for Patton's removal even after the appointment was announced. But Eisenhower had made his choice, and he stood by it. The slapping incidents would not define Patton's career or determine his role in the war. His battlefield performance would. And in the summer and fall of 1944, as the Third Army raced across France, it seemed like Eisenhower's judgment had been vindicated. Patton's drive from Normandy to the German border was everything Eisenhower had hoped for. The Third Army moved with a speed and aggression that caught the German army off balance and prevented them from establishing coherent defensive lines. Patton's ability to maintain offensive momentum, to keep pushing when other commanders would have paused to consolidate, proved decisive in the liberation of France. But the shadow of the slapping incidents never entirely disappeared. Patton was kept on a tighter leash than other Army commanders. His public statements were monitored more carefully. His interactions with subordinates were watched. Eisenhower had given him another chance, but it came with conditions and supervision that Patton clearly resented. And Patton, despite his battlefield success, never fully learned the lesson Eisenhower had tried to teach him. He continued to make inflammatory statements. He continued to grandstand and seek personal glory at the expense of coalition unity. In October 1945, after the war in Europe had ended, Eisenhower would remove him from command of the Third Army anyway, provoked by Patton's reckless public statements comparing Nazi Party members to Democrats and Republicans, and his troublingly slow approach to denazification in Bavaria. The pattern established in 1943 would repeat itself. Brilliance on the battlefield could not compensate for catastrophic failures of judgment off it. But in 1943, in the immediate aftermath of the slapping incidents, none of that was certain. What was certain was that Eisenhower had faced a choice that would have broken many commanders, and he had found a way through it that served the mission without entirely sacrificing principle. The cost of that choice was real and measurable. Eisenhower's reputation was damaged by the decision to keep Patton. He was accused of favoritism, of protecting a friend, of prioritizing military effectiveness over justice. Some of those accusations were fair. Eisenhower did protect Patton, and he did prioritize keeping an effective commander over punishing unacceptable behavior. But the alternative cost would have been real as well. Without Patton, the breakout from Normandy might have taken longer, cost more lives, and given the German army time to establish more effective defensive positions. The war might have lasted longer. More soldiers might have died. That is speculation, of course, but it was the speculation that Eisenhower had to consider when making his decision. In the end, Eisenhower chose to believe that winning the war was more important than making an example of Patton. He chose to believe that the moral compromise was worth it if it saved lives and shortened the conflict. History has never reached a clear verdict on whether he was right. What is clear is that the incident fundamentally changed the relationship between Eisenhower and Patton. They were no longer friends, if they had ever truly been friends in the first place. Eisenhower now saw Patton as a useful but dangerous tool, something to be employed carefully and watched constantly. And Patton, for his part, never forgave Eisenhower for the humiliation of the forced apologies, even though those apologies had saved his career. The two men would work together for the remainder of the war, achieving victories that helped secure the defeat of Nazi Germany. But the trust was gone. The easy camaraderie of the pre-war army had been destroyed by the slapping incidents and Eisenhower's response to them. What remained was a purely professional relationship, built on mutual dependence rather than mutual respect. For the soldiers who had been struck, the outcome was more ambiguous. Private Cool and Private Bennett both survived the war. Both were eventually given honorable discharges. Both received apologies from Patton, though whether those apologies were sincere or simply tactical compliance with Eisenhower's orders remained unclear. But the psychological damage had been done. These men had suffered under the stress of combat, had reached out for help, and had been assaulted by their commanding general for showing weakness. The message that sent to other soldiers struggling with combat stress was devastating. It reinforced the stigma around psychological trauma and made men less likely to seek help when they needed it. The medical personnel who had witnessed the incidents were equally affected. Many had hoped that Patton would be court-martialed, that the Army would make a clear statement that this kind of behavior was unacceptable regardless of rank. When that didn't happen, when Patton was allowed to keep his command and eventually resume his career, it felt like a betrayal of everything they were trying to accomplish in treating combat stress as a legitimate medical condition. Dr. Donald Currier, one of the medical officers who had filed reports on the incidents, later wrote that the decision to retain Patton had set back the cause of combat psychiatry by years. It sent a message that the psychological wounds of war were still not taken seriously at the highest levels of command, that soldiers suffering from these invisible injuries could still be seen as cowards and malingerers by those in authority. These costs were real, even if they were less visible than the battlefield victories Patton would later achieve. And Eisenhower knew it. He had made a choice that prioritized military effectiveness over justice, and he understood that there were human costs to that choice. It was a burden he carried for the rest of his life. The story of Eisenhower and Patton in the summer and fall of 1943 is not a simple morality tale with a clear hero and villain. It is a story about the impossible choices that leadership in wartime demands, about the tension between effectiveness and ethics, between winning battles and maintaining the moral authority to fight them. Eisenhower faced a decision that had no good options. Every choice carried enormous risks. Firing Patton would have satisfied justice and sent a clear message about accountability, but it might have cost lives and prolonged the war. Keeping Patton preserved a valuable military asset, but came at the cost of Eisenhower's own reputation and the well-being of soldiers who deserved better treatment. In the end, Eisenhower chose effectiveness over accountability. He chose to believe that Patton's tactical brilliance was worth the moral compromise, that winning the war justified tolerating behavior that would have ended the career of any other officer. History has never fully resolved whether that choice was right. What we can say with certainty is that it was a choice born of genuine anguish and careful calculation. Eisenhower did not protect Patton out of friendship or favoritism. He protected him because he believed, rightly or wrongly, that the mission demanded it. And he ensured that Patton paid a price for his actions, even if that price was not as severe as many believed it should have been. The contrast between the two men could not have been sharper. Patton was all ego and emotion, driven by a need for glory that overwhelmed his judgment and his humanity. He saw war as a test of personal courage and treated anything less than absolute aggression as moral failure. He could not comprehend that strength sometimes meant restraint, that leadership sometimes required compassion, that the men under his command were human beings with limits that had to be respected. Eisenhower understood all of this. He understood that war required more than tactical brilliance. It required coalition management, political awareness, moral authority, and the ability to balance competing demands from all directions. He understood that leadership meant making choices that would haunt you regardless of the outcome, that command at the highest levels was an exercise in managing impossible trade-offs with incomplete information and enormous consequences. The slapping incidents forced Eisenhower to confront these realities in the most direct way possible. He could not delegate this decision. He could not compromise or find a middle path that satisfied everyone. He had to choose, knowing that whatever choice he made would be criticized, that people would be hurt, that history would judge him. And he chose to keep Patton. Not because it was easy, not because it was popular, but because he believed it was necessary. Whether he was right remains a question that each person must answer for themselves based on their own understanding of what leadership requires and what compromises are acceptable in the pursuit of victory. What cannot be questioned is that Eisenhower came extraordinarily close to ending Patton's career in 1943. The order was written. The justification was clear. The political pressure was overwhelming, and yet, at the final moment, Eisenhower chose a different path. That choice shaped the remainder of World War II in ways both visible and invisible. It kept one of the most effective field commanders in the war, but it also sent a message about accountability that troubled many who served under Eisenhower's command. It demonstrated Eisenhower's willingness to make hard decisions and absorb political heat, but it also revealed the limits of his willingness to prioritize justice over effectiveness. In the end, the story of Eisenhower nearly firing Patton is a story about the weight of command. It is about the isolation of leadership, the burden of making choices when all options are flawed, and the human cost of decisions made in the service of larger strategic goals. It is a reminder that war is not just about tactics and logistics, but about the character of the men who lead and the moral compromises they are willing to make. Dwight Eisenhower made his choice in 1943, and he lived with the consequences of that choice for the rest of his life. Whether it was the right choice remains an open question, but it was undeniably his choice to make. And in making it, he revealed as much about himself as he did about the man he chose to protect. The letter was never sent in its final, career-ending form. Patton kept his position, went on to lead the Third Army to glory, and secured his place in military history. But he came closer to losing everything than most people ever knew. And the man who held his fate in his hands, who drafted and redrafted the reprimand that could have ended it all, was forced to carry that burden alone. That is what command means. That is what leadership costs. And that is the story of the day Eisenhower nearly fired Patton for good.